Whispers of Alcatraz. The night air was thick with mist, curling around the skeletal remains of the infamous prison like ghostly fingers. Seagulls screeched above, but their cries were lost beneath a more unsettling sound: the distant, echoing wails of the damned. Alcatraz had been closed for decades, yet visitors still claimed to hear the tormented screams of long-dead prisoners. Some dismissed it as the wind, others as the island playing tricks on the mind. But a few believed the truth: Alcatraz was never truly empty. James Holloway was not a man who feared ghosts. A journalist by trade, he had spent years chasing the macabre, abandoned hospitals, murder houses, and haunted graveyards. When his editor assigned him a piece on Alcatraz's lingering hauntings, he accepted without hesitation. "Spend the night on the island, document everything," his editor had said. "Dig deep. People love a good ghost story." James arrived in San Francisco on a cold October evening, the bay choppy and restless under a bruised sky. The tour boat was his last ride to the island before nightfall. As tourists laughed and snapped photos, James stood at the edge of the boat, staring at the prison's looming silhouette. "First time visiting?" an older man beside him asked. His name tag read R. Carter, Alcatraz staff. "Yeah," James replied. "Here for research." Carter's expression darkened. "Hope you're ready for what you'll find." By day, Alcatraz was nothing more than a crumbling relic. Tourists wandered through rusted cell blocks, their chatter filling the air. James took notes, recording the peeling paint, the corroded bars, and the eeriness that clung to the walls. The guide, an older woman with sharp blue eyes, recounted tales of attempted escapes, brutal punishments, and the chilling stories of Cell 14D, the infamous solitary confinement cell where men were driven mad. "One prisoner claimed he saw something in there," she said as they stopped before the cell. "A creature with glowing red eyes. He screamed all night. By morning, he was dead, strangled, though no one had entered the cell." James felt a chill creep down his spine. Just a story, he told himself. As the last ferry departed, James set up his equipment. His plan was simple: record audio, take photos, and document any unusual occurrences. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew heavier, charged with something unseen. Then, the first scream shattered the silence. James spun toward the sound, his heart hammering. It came from the cell block ahead, deep and guttural, filled with agony. He grabbed his recorder. "If anyone's here, make yourself known." Silence. Then, another scream, closer this time. James swallowed hard. He followed the noise, his footsteps echoing through the corridors. His breath caught as he reached the solitary confinement wing. Cell 14D's door stood ajar, though he swore it had been locked. He hesitated, then stepped inside. Darkness swallowed him. He switched on his flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the suffocating blackness. A sudden whisper sent his blood running cold. "You shouldn't be here." James staggered back. The voice was low, raspy, and right beside his ear. He swung the flashlight wildly, but the cell was empty. The door slammed shut. James pounded on the door, panic rising. The temperature plummeted. His breath came in white puffs. A shadow moved in the corner. "Leave!" The whisper became a chorus, dozens of voices layering over one another, growing louder until the screams returned, hundreds of them, wailing in torment. James fumbled for his recorder, pressing play. The device crackled, then static, and beneath it the sound of chains dragging. The cell door creaked open on its own. James stumbled out, gasping. He sprinted back toward the main hall, his mind reeling. But the prison had changed. The walls weren't crumbling anymore. They were solid, new, and the air was filled with prisoners. They walked the halls in tattered uniforms, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. Guards stood at their posts, their expressions cold and unyielding. James had stepped into the past. A bell rang, and the prisoners marched in unison. James tried to speak, but no one saw him. He was a ghost among ghosts. Then a man turned. His face was half decayed, flesh peeling from his skull. His eyes burned with hatred. "You took my place," he hissed. "Now it's your turn." A sudden force slammed into James. He fell hard, his vision blurring. The prison dissolved around him, darkness consuming everything. He awoke to the first rays of dawn streaming through a broken window. His equipment lay scattered, his recorder still running. He pressed play. "We see you, James." His blood turned to ice. James never published his story. He left San Francisco the next day, refusing to speak of what happened. But at night, in the silence of his apartment, he still heard the screams. Alcatraz had marked him, and it would never let him go. James tried to move on. Back in New York, he buried himself in work, convincing himself that what happened on Alcatraz was just a bad dream. But sleep never came easy. Every night, as he lay in bed, the screams returned. Distant at first, like an echo from across the bay. Then closer, and then the whispers. "We see you, James." The voice from his recorder. The same voice that had followed him in the prison. One night, he jolted awake to the sound of chains dragging across his bedroom floor. He shot up, his heart hammering. The room was empty, but the air was cold, Alcatraz cold. His breath came in ragged gasps as he reached for his phone. He needed help. Someone. Anyone. But the screen was filled with static. And in the middle of it, a single, rotting face. The prisoner. James threw the phone across the room, scrambling out of bed. His apartment was small, but in that moment, it felt endless. A maze of shadows and unseen figures lurking just beyond his vision. A whisper slithered through the darkness. "You took my place, James." Then, something moved in the corner. A shape, tall and skeletal, stepping out of the shadows. James didn't wait. He bolted for the door, yanking it open, only to find himself standing back in Alcatraz. No, it wasn't possible. He had left. But the cold stone walls were unmistakable. The rusted bars, the dim, flickering lights, and the prisoners. They were there watching him, hundreds of them, faces half-eaten by time, eyes filled with rage. A guard stepped forward, his uniform pristine, but his flesh blackened with decay. He smiled, a grotesque, knowing grin. "Welcome back, Holloway." James backed away, his hands trembling. "This isn't real," he whispered. "This isn't." But the guard grabbed him. Iron fingers clamped around his wrist, freezing him to the bone. "You wrote about us," the guard hissed. "You woke us up, and now you belong here." James struggled, but the strength of the dead was impossible to fight. The prisoners closed in, whispering, chanting. The cell door behind him creaked open, its rusted hinges screaming. And then darkness. Days passed, then weeks. James Holloway never returned from his trip to Alcatraz. His editor assumed he had taken off, chasing another story. But then the recordings surfaced. A park ranger found James's equipment abandoned in the prison, the audio still intact. When they played it back, they expected to hear nothing but static. Instead, they heard screams. And beneath them, James's voice. "Please, please, I'm still here." The last thing on the tape was a whisper. "We took him back." No one knows where James Holloway went. Some say he vanished into the bay. Others believe he lost his mind and disappeared. But visitors to Alcatraz still hear something at night. A new voice among the whispers. A man screaming for help. A man begging to be let out. But Alcatraz never lets anyone go. The ghost in cell 14D. The legend of James Holloway spread among the Alcatraz staff. Some dismissed it as another ghost story, but those who worked the night shifts grew uneasy. Tour guides avoided mentioning his disappearance, yet visitors started reporting a new phenomenon. In the depths of the prison, near cell 14D, a voice could sometimes be heard, a man pleading for help. At first, it was faint, blending with the usual eerie noises of the island. But as weeks passed, the voice grew louder. "Hello? Is someone there? Please, don't leave me here." A ranger named Daniel had worked at Alcatraz for 5 years. He was a skeptic until the night he heard the voice himself. He had been locking up when he passed by cell 14D and heard crying. At first, he thought a tourist had gotten lost. But when he shone his flashlight into the cell, it was empty. The crying stopped. Then, a whisper brushed against his ear. "Daniel!" He ran. James Holloway's abandoned camera was locked away in a storage room on the mainland. No one had dared to review it until a junior employee decided to take a look. The footage was mostly what they expected. Empty prison halls, static shots of corridors, muffled notes from James himself. But at 3:12 a.m., the footage changed. The camera shook violently. The sound of chains dragging filled the speakers. Then, a scream, a raw, soul-wrenching sound. The camera toppled over, landing on its side. In the frame, just for a fraction of a second, something moved. A figure, thin, gaunt, dressed in what looked like a prison uniform. And then static. The employee watching the footage never spoke of it again. Years passed, and Alcatraz remained a popular tourist attraction. But something had changed. Visitors started mentioning a man they had seen wandering the corridors alone. He didn't wear a ranger's uniform. He carried no flashlight. His clothes were old, tattered. His face was pale, hollow-eyed. He always seemed lost, confused, until he turned to look at them. His mouth would open as if to speak. But before any sound could escape, he would vanish. Some guests managed to capture blurry images. A shadow standing near cell 14D, a faint figure reflected in a glass display. And in the dead of night, when the island was supposed to be empty, the last ferry captains sometimes saw a lone figure standing at the dock, waiting, watching. But James Holloway was long gone, or at least he was supposed to be. Alcatraz has stood for decades, its walls holding the echoes of the past. Some say the island is just a tourist site now, a historical landmark. But at night, when the waters of the bay are still and the wind carries the distant sound of screams, one truth remains. Alcatraz was built to hold its prisoners, and sometimes it refuses to let them go. The voice on the radio. Months after James Holloway's disappearance, strange reports began surfacing from boat captains navigating the waters near Alcatraz. One night, Captain Eric Lawson, a seasoned ferry operator, was making his usual route back to the mainland when his radio crackled to life. Static, then a faint voice. "Can anyone hear me?" Eric frowned. The voice was weak, distorted by interference. "Please, someone, I'm still here." A chill ran down his spine. "Who is this?" he asked. Silence, then breathing, labored, shaky, then a single word. "Holloway." Eric's heart nearly stopped. He had heard the stories. Everyone had. James Holloway, the journalist who went missing after spending the night in Alcatraz. "James?" he whispered. The radio screeched, an ear-piercing blast of static. Eric jerked away, fumbling with the controls. And then, the screams began. Hundreds of voices, wailing in agony, overlapping, building in intensity until Eric slammed the radio off. But the screams didn't stop. They were inside the boat. Eric spun around, his breath catching. For a split second, he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the deck, soaking wet, his face pale, his eyes hollow, then gone. The next morning, Eric turned in his resignation. Park Ranger Angela Carter had always been fascinated by Alcatraz's haunted reputation, but she never truly believed until the night she found the extra cell. She was doing a routine security check when she noticed something odd. The numbers on the cell doors didn't add up. There was a gap in the sequence. Cells 12, 13, then 15. Cell 14 was missing. Frowning, Angela ran her hands along the cold stone wall where the missing cell should have been. To her surprise, the stone felt different, hollow. A shiver ran down her spine. There had never been mention of a hidden cell in any of the records. That night, she returned with a flashlight. She pressed against the wall, feeling for a weak spot. Then a whisper, "Help me." Angela froze. The voice was inside the wall. She stumbled back as a loud bang erupted from the other side. Something was in there, or someone. Terrified, she ran. The next day, she filed a report. But when she returned with her supervisor, the wall was solid again. No gaps, no strange sounds, And yet, when she played back the security footage, she heard it. A whisper, barely audible. "You found me." Alcatraz no longer held inmates, but one name mysteriously appeared in the old logbooks. Long after the prison had shut down. Holloway, James. Under the column labeled Status, someone had scrawled one word in faded ink. Inmate. No one could explain it. The book had been locked away for decades. The ink was old, smudged, but undeniably real. Someone or something had written his name there, and it meant only one thing. James Holloway hadn't disappeared. He had been claimed. The whispers never stop. The screams never fade. Alcatraz was more than just a prison. It was a trap, a place where the dead were never truly freed. Some say James Holloway's voice still echoes in the empty halls. Some say his ghost lingers, forever searching for a way out. But Alcatraz doesn't forgive, and it never lets go. Months after James Holloway's name appeared in the Alcatraz logbook, a late-night security guard at the island's visitor center picked up a strange radio signal. At first, it was nothing but static. Then a faint, crackling voice. "If anyone hears this, my name is James Holloway. I am still inside." The guard, startled, checked the radio's frequency. It wasn't connected to anything. The old prison's internal radio system had been deactivated years ago. "Please, listen to me. Alcatraz is still a prison. It never closed. The walls, they hold us here." Then the sound of chains dragging, and a scream. The guard yanked the plug from the radio, his hands shaking. The static cut out instantly. But as he turned away, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. A handprint, faint, cold, pressed against the glass of his security booth. It was on the inside. Tourists continued visiting Alcatraz during the day, unaware of what lurked in the walls at night. But the island was changing. More guests began reporting time slips. Brief moments where they would turn a corner and suddenly find themselves in a different Alcatraz. A younger Alcatraz. The bars no longer rusted. The floors clean. The air thick with the scent of sweat and fear. And the prisoners were still inside. One woman swore she saw a line of inmates being marched through the halls. Dressed in striped uniforms, their eyes downcast. One of them looked up at her. His face was thin, familiar. Later, when she returned home, she searched for missing persons linked to Alcatraz. When she found James Holloway's photo, she screamed. It was him. A new warden's logbook appeared in the Alcatraz archives one morning. Though no one knew where it had come from, the pages were yellowed, the ink faded. Only one entry was inside. Date: unknown. Inmate name: James Holloway. Status: life sentence. Below it, a handwritten note. This prison never emptied. Only the guards changed. No one ever found out who wrote it. But at night, if you listen closely to the wind howling through the empty corridors, you might hear it. The sound of footsteps pacing inside a locked cell. And a voice whispering from the dark. "Please, someone, let me out." But Alcatraz doesn't grant release. Not to the living, and never to the dead. The tour that went wrong. It was supposed to be a normal day on Alcatraz. The last ferry had dropped off a group of tourists, and their guide, Mark Evans, led them through the usual stops. The main cell block, the dining hall, the warden's office. But something felt off. The air was heavier than usual, thick with an unseen presence. The wind outside howled through the rusted bars like a chorus of unseen voices. Then, in D block, it happened. A woman at the back of the group suddenly gasped. Everyone turned to her. She was staring at a particular cell, 14D, the infamous solitary confinement unit. "Someone's inside," she whispered. Mark frowned. That was impossible. The cell was empty. It had been for decades. But then he saw it too. A shadow moved inside. Not a reflection. Not a trick of the light. A man, thin, pale, watching them from behind the rusted bars. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. The woman let out a shaky breath. Who was that? Mark didn't answer. He knew the stories. And deep down, he knew the truth. James Holloway was still here. The next morning, a janitor named Carlos was cleaning the administration building when he found something odd. A key, rusty, old. It was lying on the floor near the warden's office. At first, he thought nothing of it, until he turned it over and saw the engraving. Inmate 14D. His blood ran cold. That cell had been sealed for decades. There were no keys left. But here it was. Real. Solid. Waiting. Carlos hesitated, then picked it up. The moment his fingers touched the metal, the lights flickered, and in the silence of the abandoned office, he heard it. A single whisper. "Come find me." Carlos dropped the key and ran. When he returned with a coworker minutes later, the key was gone. The stories spread among the staff. People began hearing whispers in empty hallways, footsteps in locked rooms. Doors that had been open 1 second were sealed shut the next. One night, a security guard working the late shift turned to his partner and asked, "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Pause. Then the whisper came again. "Please, I'm still here." The guard turned pale, because the voice hadn't come from his radio. It had come from inside the walls. Alcatraz remains a tourist attraction. Visitors come and go, taking pictures, laughing, unaware of the prison's true nature. But some nights, when the fog rolls in thick and the bay is deathly silent, the whispers return. A single voice pleading, "I didn't escape. I never escaped." James Holloway went to Alcatraz to uncover its ghosts. Now he is one. Alcatraz remains standing, its walls holding more than just history. Tourists leave at sunset. The last ferry departs. The island is left in silence. But it is never truly empty. The whispers never stop. The footsteps still echo. And in cell 14D, if you listen closely, you can hear the soft, desperate scratching of fingernails against stone. Prisoner, long forgotten. A man who walked in freely and never walked out. James Holloway's name was erased from the records of the living. But in the depths of Alcatraz, his sentence continues. Life without parole. For Alcatraz never truly closed. And it never lets go.